car fixed? That's not good. That's where you take it to somebody that knows what to do. Right, exactly.
Say hi. Okay. Hey, darling.
How you doing?
Hanging in there.
That's me.
That's me. Yeah.
One day at a time. Thank you.
Good morning. It's time for us to start the class. I've got an announcement I want to make before Diane stops talking back there. Those of you that are watching by live stream, I'm trying to calm them down. Y'all just be patient. They hadn't seen each other since Wednesday night or last Sunday morning, and so they just all excited. No. No. I'm fine. It is good to see all of you this morning. It seemed like it's, well, I think I was here last Sunday, wasn't I? I believe. And it's awfully quiet now. We can begin. Thank you. I know I've been out a lot. I've been off preaching, and next Sunday I will be off preaching up in East Huntsville. It just happens to be the weekend of our granddaughter's 16th birthday. I don't want to be kicked out of the family at my age. And I better show up, Louise and I better show up for that birthday party. But I'll be preaching at East Huntsville Church 3 times next Sunday morning, and then I will be home. Ray's going to be out one Sunday in November. What Sunday is that, Ray? The second Sunday. I will be here the second Sunday, and I'll be speaking that morning, be teaching the Bible class that morning. And then I believe it's the 4th weekend of November. 3rd or 4th weekend in November, I'll be over at Hurley, where Stephen Lucas is the preacher, and just wants me to come up. I'm hoping it's just Sunday morning. I preached 3 times on Sunday. I did. Where was I last Sunday? Now I forget where I was last. Well, I was here last Sunday. Sunday before last, I was somewhere else. Now I've forgotten where it was, but I think I preached 3 times that Sunday. But nonetheless, I will be back in the class December, January, February, and no plans to go anywhere. I said no plans. And I don't know what chapter you're on, Ray. Chapter 7. And if we finish the book of Hebrews by the end of November, then in December, we will begin topical studies. And I will have an outline or just some kind of a small outline for you to go by. I'm not going to plan to use a PowerPoint. I want you to have something you can write on. But it will be topical studies. And I will be standing, Robert, I will be standing to teach when I come back, okay? Now, last Sunday, I remember where I was. It was Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I was in Luverne, Alabama at the Rock Hill Church. Now, somebody had to help me get up on the pulpit so I wouldn't fall. And then they had to help me get down, but I stood to preach. Now, did I hurt? I'm not even going to try to take the Fifth Amendment on that because I hurt badly. Brother Ray.
Well, good morning. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up there to Hebrews chapter 7. And we, both this week and next week, will be digging into this 7th chapter. As we begin this morning, I want to just say thank you. We'll say this in the worship hour too, for all of your support through the campaign week last week. Knocked a bunch of doors, met a lot of people, and really looking forward to seeing the fruit from that. But we appreciate your support for that, and also bringing food and encouraging our students that were here knocking doors as well. So I think the numbers are in the bulletin, but it was somewhere around 2,700 doors that were knocked and people that were spoken to. I think like 500 plus people that we talked to. So really good. And so we just need to continue to pray that there'll be fruit from that. We oftentimes like to get in a hurry when things happen. We want immediate results, and that doesn't always happen. Sometimes when we pray for people and we talk to people, it may be a while before they come around or before they remember something. You probably have felt that way with your kids. Once they get out of the house, you start thinking, well, they're just going to forget about me. No, they'll remember. They'll come home on a Friday night late with a bag full of laundry and say, hey, Mom, can you start? Oh, that was a personal story. But anyways, they will come back. But our children, of course, we try our best to teach and train them in the way they should go. And so when we look at this particular book, I think about some of the things we've dealt with this week in talking to people, is that people often have questions about Bible subjects, and we need to be prepared to be able to give a defense for what we believe, but we also need to be able to know what sources to go to. And the topic for this morning is one of those that's a difficult one. It's one that maybe we've studied before or you've thought about it before, but there's a name that comes up in the context of Hebrews chapter 7, and of course there's going to be some cross-references to the Old Testament to have a better understanding of it. But this is where we will begin in Hebrews chapter 7. And I want to read verses 1 through 10 from the New King James Version. It says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of all the spoils. And indeed, those who are the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now behold, all contradiction is lesser the blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but he receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak. For he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Now, we've kind of noticed a little bit in chapter 5, and of course last week in chapter 6, about Jesus' unique priesthood, that Jesus is set apart as a different kind of priest than the Old Testament context. So in order to help us get some groundwork here, let's start with an Old Testament example. Now, back in the Pentateuch, or in the Torah, the first 5 books, we read about the priesthood of Levi. Now, why was Levi chosen to be the priest? Does anybody remember? Why did God choose his lineage to be of the priesthood? Anybody remember? Moses had a brother who also was of the tribe of Levi, who was to give the sacrifices in the Old Testament. He receives, along with the commandments that are given to Moses, as we've read before in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, he begins to perform these duties that God has called him to do. And so Levi is the one who's supposed to organize and to plan these, because Aaron was the very first high priest. So as we move into this new covenant, it seems that it would be fitting, since God has many shadows and types or copies that we see from the Old Testament to the New Testament, that there would be a high priest, because there was a high priest in the Old Covenant. Just like so many of the things that are in the temple or in the tabernacle, for instance, here, that were very, very similar and are a completion of things in the New Testament. A lot of things they had in the Old Testament temple, and we've gone through this before, are translated into a New Testament context. So the same types of things are there. There's still a sacrifice. There's still, our prayers are like incense and so forth. And the tables show bread and communion. There's all these parallels. There needed to be a high priest. And so Jesus, of course, is the only one qualified to be able to perform this duty. Now, in the Old Testament, let's go back to the Old Testament priesthood. What happened on the day of Pentecost? Does anybody remember? Yeah, 3,000 souls are saved on Pentecost. That's the establishment of the New Testament church in the book of Acts. In the Old Testament, whenever there was a day of atonement, okay, what took place on the Day of Atonement? Anybody remember? What's that? Right, it's the one sacrifice, basically, to lack of better terms, rolls all the sins forward until the crucifixion of Christ. So they have these sacrifices they perform, but on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would have gone into the Holy of Holies and performed his duties as he is commanded to in the Old Testament. Jesus is our high priest. And so what Hebrews does is it paints this picture, kind of like a temple complex or a tabernacle complex. And Jesus goes beyond the veil. He goes further than we can go as the high priest under the Aaronic priesthood or the Levitical priesthood could do. And so that's something to carry with us as we move forward, is Jesus is our high priest now, very different. But looking back at the Old Testament context, it is much like the priesthood of Aaron or the priesthood of Levi. So keep that in mind, kind of put a pin in that for a second. Whenever we read this section of Scripture, there are several different things that jump out off the page to me about the history of this priesthood. Now, if we go back to the book of Genesis in chapter 14, and I think this is helpful, so put your marker there in Hebrews chapter 7, and then I want us to take a little journey in time back to Genesis, and let's see the background of what the Hebrew writer's talking about here. So we're in Genesis chapter 14, 1 through 11. It says, "It came to pass in the days of Aphrahel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Eliezer, and Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, the king of Admah, Shemabar, king of Zebolim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked Rephaim in Azaroth, Karnaim, the Zunnim in Ham, the Emim in Shava, Kirithaim. Are y'all struggling like me here? All right, and the Horites in the mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. So you get the idea that there are a lot of kings at war, right? Okay, move on down with me to verse 10. It says, "Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and remained fled to the mountains. Then they took the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." So what happens is, basically Lot gets swept up in this skirmish between nations. And so he is taken captive. Now, along with Lot, of course, would have been his family that had been taken captive by these kings. So keep reading with me. It says, let's go back down to verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt there by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Ener, and were allies of Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, and that means his brothers is his brethren, his family, of course, taken captive, he armed his 318 trained soldiers who were born in his house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, pause here for just a moment with me. He's outmatched and outgunned, okay, for lack of a better term. He takes 318 guys. Now, how many kings did we go through there? And I only went through half the verses. So there's a lot of war taking place in this part of the world. He is swept up and captured as a part of this warfare going on. So this is obviously something Abraham wanted to stay out of, okay? He didn't want to go. So he's outmatched, he's outmanned, he's outgunned, but he takes 318, that says trained soldiers. So these are his guys that are protecting the flocks and protecting the family. And he decides to go after Lot. It says he divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. So in other words, he's completely successful with this little band of men. Now, I want you to notice something else too about Abraham's character. He is successful in his efforts, but he could have easily taken more property or land if he wanted to, because this is all about territorial rights. But what we need to remember about Abraham is he's not going to invest or use his money for land because he's not where God wants him to be yet. In fact, God has told him, I'm going to send you to a land, I'm going to take you to a place. And that particular place is where his descendants would rise up and create a nation. So Abraham's not interested in that. He doesn't worry about trying to stake his flag in somebody else's yard. He rescues Lot, he gets the spoils, and he comes home. And that's also key about his character when we move to the next part of the story. So he brings back all the goods, he brings back all the women, all the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him, that is Abram, gave him a tithe of all. Then it says, Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you say, I've made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who were with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So again, a part of Abram's character here is he doesn't stake his flag in a yard, he doesn't take property, he doesn't worry about territorial rights. And when all the things are brought to basically a common ground where they can divide the spoils, it says that he gives a tenth to Melchizedek, and then he distributes everything exactly where it came from. And he said, the only thing we've taken is what we had to eat from there to here. And so it tells you a lot, it does me anyway, about what Abraham's doing. He is waiting for the promise of God to be fulfilled. He's waiting to be able to receive what God has said. So as we enter this story, there's this character, Melchizedek. Now, in verses 1 through 3, it says on the notes, if you have the book on page 51, that when Abram rescues him and he's met by Melchizedek, the first thing that we notice is the term King of Salem. Now, this is before, just going to give you a little history, before Jerusalem is the name of this region. It's just Salem. And he is the king of Salem. That means he is the ruler, the right territorial ruler of this area. He is, this man, Melchizedek, is a priest under the order of Melchizedek. So he's called King of Salem. He's also called a priest of God Most High. Now, I want you to notice also in the prayer or in the blessing, he compares himself, or at least his role, to that of Abram. Did you see that? It says, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." But yet it says in verse 18 that he was a priest of God Most High. So if something's repeated 3 times in 2 verses, you take note of it. So this person, this Melchizedek, sees himself on, if you will, equal footing in their role in fulfilling the will of God. He's a priest of the Most High God, and Abram is the one who is about to create this great nation out of his children, his grandchildren. So when we go back to Hebrews, we learn a little bit about what this means, the significance of it. And what the Hebrew writer does is he gives us a few more little details about this guy's life. And it's one of those things, kind of a head scratcher. Maybe if you're like me and you like to watch movies or read books, you'll see a little detail and you go, well, I wonder what that is. Usually if there's an odd detail that makes no reference to anything else, you kind of think about that for a minute later, because basically that's going to tie you back to a plot point. So that little detail about this guy showing up and being a priest is basically all we know until we read the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews says that not only was a priest, he has a special calling. And it talks a little bit about his background. So let me mention again, he's called King of Peace, he's called King of Righteousness, he's called the King of Salem, but now we reach the other details. It says he was, quote, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, made like the Son of God, and remains a priest continually. So now, let's focus on each of those details before we decide to try to figure out who this guy is and what he did. What do you think it means when it says no father, no mother, no genealogy? We don't know who he is, and we don't know where he comes from. Now, I submit to you that that's intentional. God didn't do that by accident. There's a reason why there's no genealogy given. It doesn't matter in the plot points of the story. But what does matter is this random guy in the middle of the wilderness receiving a tenth of everything Abram had taken. So Abram considers him to be, as a priest of the Most High God, the one and only priest that is deserving of the spoils. Remember, he doesn't take it back to his camp. He doesn't share it with his wife, doesn't share it with his kids, but he gives 10% to Melchizedek, the king of Salem. So it says he doesn't have a father, mother, no genealogy. We have no idea where he came from, who he is. The next thought, it says, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. What does that sound like? That's right. Don't know when he was born. Don't know when he died. There is no record. How many of you have ever walked around in a cemetery and seen a stone where it just has a year and doesn't have a date? Where they say, well, this person died in this year, but we're not sure of the exact date or the birth year. Sometimes when you come across gravestones, at least in our family cemetery, of children that have died, it just has son of or daughter of, and has the parent. They didn't get a name to the child, you know. But it just has a date, like 1904 or something. So that's in modern day times that we often don't take a record or a note. It's kind of like that in that ball game yesterday. Couldn't figure out if it was fourth down or third down. Remember that? So we do that. We have those moments where we forget a date or we're unsure of a date. And so they will not try to guess. They just put son of, daughter of, and maybe a date. There's a man that died, was buried at our family cemetery, and my grandpa said, if I don't get a tombstone on there, he'd been dead for like 70 years. But he said, I helped dig the grave, and I'm probably the only person that knows where he's buried. And before I die, I want to put a little stone up or some kind of a sheet in case his family ever comes looking for him. He lived alone there in the Ozark Mountains. But the point is, even in modern day times, we can't always know the history of where somebody comes from, how old they are or how young they are. You see sometimes on social media or in the news somebody that appears in China and they claim to be 109 years old. Well, we don't know. So we kind of have to wonder. Guinness Book of World Records will go out there and have to interview them and ask questions to prove whether or not they're the age that they say they are. But again, in modern times even, we struggle with keeping these kinds of records. So then it says he's made like the Son of God. Made like the Son of God. What does that mean? What does that sound like? Do what? He resembles the Son of God. Now, there are some places in the Bible where phrases are often used, like Son of Man or Son of God. In fact, Son of Man is used 98 times in Ezekiel alone. In Daniel, whenever Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are in the fiery furnace, it says that there is one like the Son of God or the Son of Man inside the fire. Okay? In Psalms, repeatedly, these phrases are used, Son of God, Son of Man. It does not necessarily mean that it's deity, but those phrases are used. So, man, could somebody help us out? There are a couple places here in Hebrews that I think might help. One is in chapter 4 and verse 15. Here he says, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." We now have a high priest, of course, clear from the text, under the order of Melchizedek, that is sympathetic to our needs because he has walked in our flesh. That's a difficult thing to wrap our minds around, is that God put on flesh. So when Jesus walks around on the earth, he considers himself, calls himself the Son of Man. There are times he's referenced as the Son of God. Peter is a great example. It calls him the Son of God, Son of the living God. Here's another one, Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 22. Maybe this will help us a little bit. It says, "And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood, there is no remission." The one who performs the sacrifice, which, by the way, as Paul calls it, a one-for-all sacrifice, is one who can do it according to the law, shedding his own innocent blood, where then remission can be provided for all of humanity. Now, much like the Day of Atonement sacrifice, but Jesus offers himself once for all. So it makes sense that if Jesus is the sacrificial lamb and he lays his life down and he's perfect, there's probably some other, lack of a better term, perks to the job. There are other responsibilities of Jesus as the one for all sacrifice. And this is one of those duties, those responsibilities, is to be recognized as high priest. So, let's go back to a couple thoughts. In the notes, this is on page 52, it says, some have suggested that Melchizedek could have been an angel. And again, we go back to Daniel. We've got a few other references in the Old Testament. It says that Origen and Didymus both considered Melchizedek to be an angel. In Husius and Calment, which are two other examples there, that's under B, Enoch is suggested to be the one in it. That sounds like a plausible option. Of course, Enoch back in the book of Genesis says he was not found. He was just translated. There's only two guys that get that special privilege. One is Enoch. The other is Elijah. That's right. Elijah took off and did not die. So, well, obviously when he hit the atmosphere, he did. But the idea is, here we've got Enoch and we've got Elijah, two guys who did not suffer a cruel or at least some kind of a death on this planet. All right, they are taken to God immediately. So, again, some people say, well, maybe this is Enoch because this has happened. Elijah's much later. Maybe Enoch has been retranslated. Now, not to shed too much of a discouragement on those particular options. Another one is Shem, by the way. People say it's Shem. Jerome in the early church fathers, even Martin Luther said it was possible it was Shem. I don't think that the Bible would give us a specific name unless there is a little more to the story. What was the name of the angel who blocked the road for Balaam's donkey? What about the angel that wrestled with Jacob? What was the name of, okay, you get the point. There's a lot of angels in Scripture. We don't have a clue what their name is. We don't know what they do. They just have a specific duty. So why would God give Melchizedek a name if he's really an angel? He's Enoch. He's Shem. Why would he do that? Okay, so some people say, well, this is Jesus. And this probably, of all the different examples, this is probably the one that's most popular. People think that Melchizedek is Christ himself. And there's a few statements here. And again, back to the notes, Mark's notes on page 52, it says they suggest Melchizedek was a theophany. That is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. That is, Jesus appeared in flesh, but it wasn't Jesus the way we see him in the New Testament, just his spirit. Another one is, it talks about him being the king of righteousness, the king of peace. Those sound like terms that are similar to Jesus. Like, for instance, Isaiah 9 and verse 6 talks about Jesus as the prince of peace. So again, some very similar terms that could be an example. It says the possibility that the lack of recorded genealogy mentioned in verse 3 is due to an actual lack of ancestors or mere absence of historical records. So he says he's a priest continually. In other words, he didn't have a replacement. That's the better way to look at it. Levi, according to the Old Testament, is every time someone of the Levitical priesthood that was in the position of high priest died, their oldest son took over that role. Well, he doesn't have children. He doesn't have genealogy. He has no brother to carry on his genealogy line. He has no other child that's being born of his mother and father because they're not in existence. And so there's no one else to be an heir of his priesthood. You follow me? This is the reason why only Jesus qualifies. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. He was given 10%. Right. So, he's given a tithe of everything. Now, this is before the old law is written, some 400 plus years before the old law is written. But Melchizedek receives a tithe, which later, under the Old Covenant, is an example of worship, okay? It's part of our worship. We still give today. It's not considered a tithe, but we still give today. It's a part of the New Testament worship, just like prayer was a part of Old Testament worship. We have prayer today, and so forth, a lot of these parallels. But he receives something that is very similar to, and the word is used to the Old Covenant reference to God. So it's another example of people say, well, this could be Jesus, because he's receiving something as the Son of God, as an example of some 400 years later, be giving a tithe to those of the Levitical priesthood. Now, another thing, too, along those lines is there is nothing else about where he serves as a priest. That's not in the notes here, but that's my thought. How come we don't have a specific location for a temple? He's the priest. The priest of what? The priest of where? All we have is the priest of whom? That's it. Where is his temple? Where is his altar? Where is his followers? Where are his descendants? We get nothing. Okay? I get the sense that when I'm reading this, that even the Hebrew writer knew that people sat around, just like we're sitting around today, scratching their head. You know, who is this guy? What's his story? And so he gives us a few other details to show that he was not only of God, but Jesus to receive the inheritance, the direct line as heir under this new order, this new priesthood. And it says, of him it is witnessed that he lives, okay? So there's no doubt this guy really existed. It's not a figment of Abram's, imagination. He is a real priest. But no mention of parentage, no mention of genealogy, no mention of birth or death, no mention of anything other than he's a priest to the Most High God. And he's a type of Christ, as we're recognizing it now from the book of Hebrews. So the true identity of Melchizedek, I believe, is meant to be a mystery. Now, when talk about him being just another human, just another guy, there's a few good arguments for that. I'll give them to you. In Matthew chapter 1, and this is important, Matthew chapter 1, Matthew is, as a Jew, he's very well educated. He's writing a gospel account. He's trying his best to give a presentation of the gospel to those that are Jews, right? It's written from a Jewish perspective. When you begin to look at the well-documented, and I mean meticulous, specific documentation of book, chapter, and if you're a book, chapter, and verse guy, you're going to love Matthew. That's the reason why Matthew comes first. On every single page, he says, and Jesus did that, and by the way, it was a fulfillment of this. And Jesus said this, and it was a fulfillment of that. Jesus went here, he did these things, and it's a fulfillment of every page. In fact, I have a Bible that when I studied through the book of Matthew, I highlighted all of the prophecies in purple. And when you look at Matthew, it bleeds purple from every page. There's more purple in there than red, because there's so many prophecies that Matthew fulfills. Now, look at, if you will, here, look at let's go to verse 8, okay? So it says, and again, bear with me with the names. Asa begat Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat begat Joram, and Joram begat Uzziah, okay? 3 guys. We know a little bit about them because we're also told their story in 1 Chronicles. Let me show you this. 1 Chronicles chapter 3. 1 Chronicles chapter 3. Now remember those names there in that list. And we're going to find verse 11 and 12. All right, so actually let's back up to verse 10. Solomon's son was Rehoboam. Abijah was his son. Asa was his son. Jehoshaphat was his son. Joram was his son. Ahaziah his son. Joash his son. Amaziah his son. Azariah his son. Jotham his son. Now, probably never are going to, I hope that we don't have this as the one question we're going to be asked on entrance into the gates of heaven. Can you tell me the 3 genealogies behind Rehoboam? Okay. But if you are taking note of names, there are 3 names that are mentioned here that are not mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. There are 3 kings here that are mentioned only in Chronicles. So for whatever reason, Matthew leaves them out. Here are the names. They are Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. Those 3 guys here in verses 11 and 12 are not mentioned when you get to Matthew chapter 1. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 1. So why would Matthew, this guy who is giving book, chapter, and verse, start his whole gospel off by leaving 3 names off the genealogical list? Well, as you go down and you look at what he's saying, he begins to compare these to 14 generations. So I've heard people say, well, he's trying to get to number 14, so he has to leave these 3 off. I don't think that's the case at all. Nothing's happening by accident here. Well, what do we know about these 3 guys? If you've read through the scriptures, you know they were evil, they were wicked, they did evil in the sight of God. In Jewish history. Is that my bell already? Oh my goodness. In Jewish history, whenever you left the faith or you were wicked, you were basically written out of the book. In the prodigal son story, there's a phrase that's repeated over and over and over again for a specific reason. It says, your brother who was dead is now alive. He was dead and now alive. He now lives. The statement is said to the son, the statement is said to the servants, the statement is said to the older brother. The reason why is in Jewish culture, they would literally kill you off in the story. You ever watched a TV program and suddenly the character's gone? You go, what happened to him? I guess they killed him off. Unless you're a soap person and then they kill him off like 15 times, keep coming back. But the point is, Matthew doesn't use these three names not because they're not important, but because they were wicked. And he's giving a genealogy of Christ, and it was not uncommon to leave names off. Now, what's that got to do with the price of eggs in China, right? Let's go back to our story about Melchizedek. The significance of this character is that he had no family, no mother, no father. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's this miraculous angel that pops in for a minute and then disappears. It's very likely that, for whatever reason, as a spiritual person, he has not given any details. Nobody knows anything else about him. So the only reason we kind of get to this point we're having this controversy is when we begin to read commentaries. Okay, and that's sometimes where we get hung up. Say, well, this person says this, and this person says that. There's a reason why God didn't want us to know his background. We would spend more time thinking about Melchizedek than Jesus, who is greater than Melchizedek. That makes sense? All right. Anybody have any questions? No, we got like 2 minutes. All right, so let's talk about the tithe. The tithe that is given to him, it says that he is greater. Jesus is greater. The tithes, the blessings, not affected by death. Jesus, obviously, from before the beginning of time, Jesus has always been there. So he's not only older than Levi. This example is older than Abraham. He's more effective. He's a high priest. Jesus is greater for all these specific reasons. And again, these are in the notes. And the offerings and the blessings that Christ gives are better because his life was not for the covering of sin for a year on the Day of Atonement, but for all sins of all mankind. So there's a great parallel here, but Jesus is greater. He is greater than all. Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, if it was... y'all remember getting gas like 2 years ago? What's happened? What about bread? The price up? How about milk? Okay, all right. Now, stay with me. If under the old law, this is this is more than 4,000 years ago, that the going rate was 10%. Don't you think God deserves a raise? I mean, if it was 10% under Melchizedek and 10% under the old law, then it would make sense why Jesus says to his disciples, you better exceed that of the Pharisees. So our goal is to be as generous. In fact, Paul doesn't put a number on it specifically because he knows how we are. We would say, well, it's 11% or 12%. We give more to the government than we give to the church. I mean, we talk about it. You know, we give a lot to a lot of people and a lot of things. So we've got to sit down and look at how we give to God's work. If 4,000 years ago, Abraham says the best I got is 10%. That's the best. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know. I do know this is the reason why some religious groups now, when you place membership, they automatically do direct withdrawal from your paychecks. When I lived in Idaho, that's what the Mormon church does. When you place your membership, you're baptized into the Mormon church, they automatically take your, go to your place of work, and they have an automatic withdrawal of your 10%. So that way you can't say, I couldn't give today. It already comes off the top. So, interesting. All right. Come back tonight, too, because we're going to talk a little bit more about this evening. So, looking forward to that. I'll stop now since we're past time. So if you need to take a break, go to the restroom, get a bulletin, we'll get started with worship in about 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I did. I was. I got it. I got it early this morning. I hadn't noticed that.
I got to run next door, but I'll be right back.
Here they are.
Hi.